Welcome to this episode on how to paint a bluebird in pastel. I used a light gray pastel pencil to transfer my image to my Uart 600 grit sanded paper. And I've used an eraser on some areas to erase the lines from the paper, but my pastels are covering it really well, so I don't really need to erase it. With the additional layers of pastel, it will cover it completely. I'm using a free reference photo from my Facebook group, and the photographer's name was Kay Ernie. Now that I've applied a couple layers of color, I'm able to blend the colors very smoothly using my fingers. I will be completing the entire background before I begin working on the Bluebird. The focal point of this painting is the Bluebird's face. So as I develop the background, I will keep a lighter shade of blue toward the top of his head to bring a little more focus to this area. I want to continue developing the background of my painting with more layers of color until the tooth of the paper has been completely covered and the surface looks very smooth and blended well. I'm going to begin at the top of his head and work my way down his body. I'm going to begin with a light shade of blue just to establish a base layer in the bird's face. I will be using a paper stump blender to apply the first layers of color to the bird. The paper stump blends the color very nicely into the paper, especially in small areas where it's difficult to use my fingertips. I only use my rubber blending tip after I've established a few layers of color. Otherwise, it tends to smudge and not blend smoothly as a paper blending stump. I used my black pastel pencil just to outline the bird's eye, but I'm primarily using shades of dark blue and bright blue for the darkest values in the bird's face and beak. Once I have completed outlining the bird's beak, I will continue to add some color to the bird's face feathers using some light orange, a copper color orange, to create some shadows and light feathers to contour the shape of his face. I'm going to begin developing the bird's breast feathers. I'm going to begin with a dark brown pastel to create the shadowed area beneath his plumage. The bluebird has fluffed up his feathers along the neckline, and this creates shadows that I am outlining. Once I have it blended well, then I'll be able to go back and add the lighter shades of feathers that have been fluffed up in his neckline. I will continue to add some dark brown very lightly to the chest of the bird, and I'm using a pattern that represents the shadows in the bird's feathers. Then I'll be able to switch to a darker shade of a copper color orange to start developing the color within the bird's chest. once I've established enough color, and I'll be able to use my paper stump to blend it all together. I'm very happy with how it's blending these first layers of color to his chest. I can already feel the fullness and softness of the feathers. So now I'd like to move on and shape the bird's wing, and then I'll move on to developing the down feathers in the bird's belly area. Once I start developing the bird's feathers in his belly area, I will start with a light gray as a base layer to the paper, and then I will use shades of violet and blue for the shadowed areas cast at the lower edge of his body. Now that I have completed the base layers of the bird's chest and belly, I'm going to complete his feathers and create the patterns and colors of his plumage on his chest and belly. He has some patterns of blue that follow through his neckline that I've added. It will also create a darker shadow to the small fluffed up feathers in his neckline. I will use a light orange for some of my highlights in his neckline, and then I will switch over to using my large soft pastel stick to bring out the top layer highlights in the bird's feathers. I like to use the soft pastel for the top layer because it covers very easily and very adequately. I can use the sharp edge of my pastel stick to create these very light highlights in his neckline and top layer of his breast feathers. Once I've completed adding these highlights in the feathers, I'll go back with a darker shade of orange underneath some of these light areas to give it more depth to these feathers. Now that I have defined most of his feathers, I'm going to add some of the light feathers that extend off the surface of his feathers into the background. Light seems to reflect off these fine feathers, but pulls the entire painting together. So now I'd like to start drawing the bird's feet. He is clasping onto the branch of the limb, and I'll begin using my black pastel pencil. I want his feet to be very sharp and detailed, so I've applied some alcohol with a very fine brush to solidify the black in his feet. I will also use a shade of gray and white to define the highlights in his feet. Once I have his feet placed, I will begin outlining his tail feathers using my black pastel pencil. His body is casting a very dark shadow in this area, so I will use some black and very dark blue to define the shadowed areas in his tail feathers. So now I'd like to finish the final details of this painting. I need to add some more orange feathers to the shadowed areas of his tail feathers and complete the highlights in the bird's feet. Once I have these details completed, I'd like to move on and define the branch that he's sitting on in the foreground. Once I begin working on the branches, I will switch back and forth between the feathers and the branches as I develop the dark values in the branch. The branches will cast a shadow on the bird's feathers, so once I have them defined, it's easier to ensure the right value in the bird's feathers. The bottom portion of this twig has some white fungus growing on it, but I think it adds some nice interest to the painting. I will continue to shape the twig and the branches in the background, and then this painting will be nearly complete. With this twig in the foreground and the branches in the background, it creates a lot of depth and dimension to this painting. I hope you have enjoyed this demonstration of painting a bluebird. This is actually a male eastern bluebird found here in South Carolina. He's one of my favorite birds, and we have a nesting box in our backyard, and they frequent it 2 or 3 times a year in the spring. If you have enjoyed this video, please press like and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so already. Also, if you press the bell icon, you will receive notifications with all my new videos. Thank you for watching and see you next time.